Amari dropped it from shoulder height, letting the frozen block of meat land with a satisfying thud that echoed through the marble kitchen. She rolled her sleeves up, surveyed the damage. Still solid, still pink in the center, completely useless for a 7:30 prep, and did what she always did when faced with a problem inside this cold, immaculate, aggressively dramatic mansion. She started talking. "Who buys a $4,000 stove?" she muttered, pulling out a bowl, switching to Korean mid-sentence the way she always did when she was annoyed. "And eats frozen lamb every week. Same lamb, like some kind of cursed tradition." She turned the cold water on and submerged the vacuum-sealed bag, watching the ice begin to sweat. A man with 11 cars and 1 personality. That's who. She moved to the spice cabinet, reached past the ornamental jars nobody actually used. All labeled, all organized by someone who had clearly never cooked a meal in their life, and found her own small stash tucked behind a decorative bottle of something that cost more than her monthly rent. "There is a painting of a horse on that wall," she pointed without looking. "And that horse is not happy. That horse has seen things." She shook her head. She seasoned the bowl. She kept going. 8 months? She said quietly, warmly, like she was comforting herself. 8 months, Amari. And then you walk. You walk out those gates. You pay the last of your father's debt. And you never see the inside of a gothically depressing mansion again. You'll eat somewhere with color. You'll work somewhere with windows. She heard nothing. No Furzt. No shift of air. No warning at all. Just the soft sound of a presence behind her, measured, unhurried, and completely silent in the way that only one person in this entire estate managed to be. She didn't turn around. She kept seasoning. Ji-hoon reached past her without a word, picked up the frozen lamb from the water bath, turned it over in his hands with the detached focus of someone who inspected things for a living, and set it back down. Amari held perfectly still. He said nothing for 4 seconds. She counted. Then, in flawless, unhurried English, "The marbling on this cut is excellent." A pause. "Unlike your seasoning technique." Amari turned around slowly. Ji-hoon was already looking at her. Not with surprise, not with amusement, not with the cold boardroom expression he wore like a second skin. Just looking, like he'd been waiting for her to figure it out. Her mouth opened, closed. He picked up his coffee from the counter, the one she'd made 11 minutes ago, exactly as he liked it, the way nobody else had gotten right in 3 years, and walked out of the kitchen without another word. Amari stood in the silence. She looked at the lamb. She looked at the door. She looked at the painting of the deeply unhappy horse. "How long?" she said, to nothing, to the air, to every terrible decision she'd ever made. And then she stopped, because she realized she was still speaking in Korean, and apparently that was no longer a safe language. "If you want to know how this ends, and trust me, it ends unhinged. Smash that like button, subscribe, and drop frozen lamb in the comments below. Let's get into it." Amari had not planned on becoming a maid. She had a linguistics degree, a near-photographic memory for grammar structures, and the particular kind of brain that absorbed language patterns the way other people absorbed song lyrics, effortlessly, completely, and usually at inconvenient times. By 24, she spoke 6 languages with varying degrees of fluency, 2 of which she'd learned from podcasts and 1 of which she'd picked up entirely by watching a TV drama series over a single long weekend. She was objectively overqualified for almost everything she'd done in the past 3 years. But her father had died owing money to people who didn't send polite letters. They sent representatives, in suits, who stood outside the apartment with a patience that was worse than any threat. And Amari, who had no siblings and no remaining family and a complicated love for a man who had not been a good businessman but had been a very good father, had looked at the number, looked at her options, and made a decision. She would work. She would save. She would be free. The agency had placed her with 3 households before Ji-hoon's estate. 2 had been manageable. 1 had been a woman who wanted her to reorganize the pantry alphabetically and then wept when Amari suggested the methodology had limitations. Amari had left that placement with her professionalism intact and a very clear picture of what kind of work she could and could not do long-term. Then the agency called about the Park estate. "The client is private," the coordinator had said, in the careful tone of someone choosing words with both hands. He values discretion. The pay is, well, you'll want to sit down. She had not sat down. She had stood in her small apartment with its one window and its outstanding stack of debt statements and said yes before the coordinator finished the sentence. She had seen Ji-hoon exactly 3 times in the first month. He moved through his own home like a rumor, present in the evidence left behind, rarely visible in person. A half-drunk glass of water on the study desk at 2 a.m. A jacket folded too precisely over the back of a chair. The faint smell of a very expensive, very serious cologne that had absolutely no business being that effective. The staff did not talk about him. Not out of loyalty, out of something that functioned closer to self-preservation. They did their jobs, they did not make eye contact at unnecessary moments, and they ate their lunch quickly. Amari was not built for that kind of silence. She was built for commentary. Started small. A murmur about the throw pillows, 14 of them across the main sitting room sofa, in coordinated shades of gray, none of which showed any evidence of ever being thrown. Decorative imprisonment, she whispered in French, tucking the 7th one back into alignment. That's what this is. It grew from there. The chandelier in the east corridor. Gothic wrought iron, shaped like a crown of thorns. She addressed it directly in Mandarin one Tuesday afternoon, pointing at it with a feather duster. You are extraordinary, she told it. And also deeply unwell. We could get you some help. A therapist. Some warm lighting. You don't have to do this. The painting of the horse, which she passed every morning on the way to the kitchen, received daily commentary in Korean, the language she'd picked up fastest, partly because she'd been watching Ji-hoon's Country of Origins entertainment since she was a teenager and partly because the grammatical structure appealed to the organized section of her brain. You look worse today, she told the horse on a Wednesday. I think it's the lighting. Or maybe it's the fact that you're trapped on a gray wall in a mansion that owns 0 plants. Not one plant, my friend. You are the most alive thing in this room and you're made of oil paint. She did not think anyone was listening. Ji-hoon had a camera system that covered 43 points of the estate interior. He had personally reviewed the installation. He was aware of every angle. She did not know this yet. What she did know was that the coffee situation was a puzzle, and puzzles were her weakness. She'd found out on her 3rd day that the previous housekeeper had lasted 19 months without once making Ji-hoon's coffee correctly. The current estate manager had confessed this the way people confess embarrassing medical conditions, quietly with the eyes slightly averted. He never says anything about it, the manager had said. He just doesn't drink it. Amari had found this deeply offensive. Not personally, but professionally. It was coffee. It was a solvable problem. She'd spent 1 week observing the pattern. Noticed the brand he ordered, the grind he kept in the freezer, the cup size he reached for when he was working late versus the one he used in the morning. Noted that he discarded anything with even a trace of bitterness and that he added nothing, no sugar, no cream, which meant the quality of the extraction had to carry the whole weight of the drink. On day 12, she made it correctly. She left it on the corner of his desk without a word, without a note, without any indication that she expected acknowledgement. She was in the hallway when she heard him take the first sip. She pumped her fist exactly once, silently, and walked away. He never mentioned it. But the cup was always empty when she came to collect it. 8 months of this. 8 months of being invisible, being competent, being quietly, relentlessly there, and she was so close to the finish line she could almost smell the outside world. She had written the number on a sticky note and stuck it to the inside of her locker. She'd been crossing off days like a sentence she was almost done serving. She was 37 days away from free. 37 days became 30. 30 became 2 weeks. 2 weeks became the morning Amari woke up, checked the number on the sticky note, and sat on the edge of her bed in the staff quarters for a long moment doing absolutely nothing except breathing. She had enough. She counted it 3 times. Then a 4th time because she was her father's daughter and he had always said that numbers deserved respect. The total sat in her account, quiet and solid and real, and she stared at it on her phone screen until the screen dimmed and went dark. She got up. She showered. She put on her uniform for what she had decided would be one of the last times. She wrote the resignation letter at the small desk in her room, in clear professional English, 2 weeks' notice, effective immediately upon acknowledgement. Thank you for the opportunity, best regards. She read it back twice. It was dignified. It was clean. It said absolutely nothing about Gothic chandeliers or unhappy horses or 14 throw pillows that had never once been touched. She was proud of it. She folded it into an envelope, put the envelope in her apron pocket, and walked to the kitchen to begin the morning prep. And then the problem was that she was happy. Genuinely, quietly, bubbling under the surface, happy in a way she hadn't been in 3 years. And happiness for Amari had always been a physical condition. It lived in her feet first. It wanted to move. She told herself to wait. She prepped the counter. She started the coffee. She got the eggs from the refrigerator and set them in a line with more ceremony than they required. She made it 6 minutes before the feet one. It started as a small shimmy. Just her shoulders, just a little, while she waited for the water to boil. Then her hips got involved. Then she was doing a full rotation with the spatula raised like a scepter, mouthing the words to a song playing only in her head, spinning once on the ball of her foot with a form that was enthusiastic rather than technically impressive. 2 weeks, she whispered in Korean, pointing at the ceiling with the spatula. Professional. Dignified. She did a small kick. No celebrating until you're outside the gate, she spun again. But we're inside the gate and nobody is watching, so we are briefly, privately celebrating. She took a bow to the kitchen at large. The kitchen did not respond. She straightened up, smoothed her apron, turned to the counter, and Ji-hoon was standing in the doorway. He was in his morning clothes, dark, fitted, the kind of casual that cost the same as formal on most people. His coffee was not yet in his hand because his coffee was still brewing on the counter 3 feet from Amari. He was not on his phone. He was not looking at anything except her. He had the expression of a man who had seen many things and was now filing this one in a specific category. Amari set the spatula down on the counter with a sound that was much too loud in the silence. She reached into her apron pocket, retrieved the envelope, set it on the counter between them with both hands, flat, like she was placing evidence. 2 weeks' notice, she said, in English, crisp and clear. Professional resignation. Effective upon acknowledgement. Ji-hoon looked at the envelope. He looked at her. He walked to the counter, picked up his coffee, because it had finished brewing at exactly the right moment, as it always did, because Amari had never once gotten his coffee wrong, and took a slow sip. The silence stretched for so long that Amari started mentally drafting follow-up remarks. Then he set the cup down and looked at her with something in his eyes that was not quite amusement and not quite warmth, but lived in the approximate neighborhood of both. Your Korean accent is improving, Amari. Pause, deliberate and precise. But your dance moves are terrible. He picked up the envelope, considered it for 1 moment, slid it back across the counter to her. Resignation denied. Amari stared at the envelope. She stared at him. She stared at the envelope again. You can't deny a resignation, she said. I just did. That's not how employment law works. I have 11 lawyers. If employment law becomes relevant, I'll let them know. She picked up the envelope, held it in both hands. I have enough to pay the remaining balance on my father's debt. I have fulfilled the terms of my employment contract. I am giving you the required 2 weeks' notice as stipulated in that contract. This is legal. This is final. This is... Do you want more money? She stopped. What? Your rate. Is it the issue? He said it the way someone asks if you'd like a different table at a restaurant. Mild. Practical. Already moving toward a solution before the problem had been fully named. It's not about the money. Then what is it about? She opened her mouth, closed it. The honest answer was freedom, but that was not a sentence she was willing to say to this man in this kitchen while he drank the coffee she'd perfected for him, looking at her like she was a mildly interesting variable in an equation he'd already solved. 2 weeks, she said again, firmly. I'll complete the full 2 weeks. I'll train my replacement on the coffee. I'll document the household systems. I'll leave everything in order. Ji-hoon picked up his cup. You'll need to document more than the coffee. I'm documenting everything. Good. He turned toward the door, then stopped. Didn't turn back. Just paused, shoulders still, voice dropping half a register in a way that she would think about later and not fully be able to explain. The horse painting, by the way, I had it installed because it was my mother's. She thought it looked dignified. He walked out. Amari looked at the painting of the horse on the kitchen wall. The horse, as always, looked deeply unhappy. I'm sorry, Amari told it quietly, in Korean. Then she caught herself, closed her eyes for 2 full seconds, and said nothing else for the remainder of the morning. She spent the next 4 days waiting for something to happen. Nothing happened. Ji-hoon moved through the estate at his usual frequency. Rarely visible, consistently present in evidence. The coffee disappeared. The files on his desk shifted. The lights in the study burned past midnight. Amari documented. She cleaned. She trained the new girl the agency had sent. A quiet young woman named Soo-yeon who took notes with impressive focus and asked no unnecessary questions and looked at the chandelier in the east corridor with the respectful neutrality of someone who had not yet developed opinions about it. Amari felt a strange, unreasonable pang watching her. She dismissed it immediately. On the 5th morning she woke at 5:30 to the sound of cars. Multiple cars. Moving fast across the gravel approach, which was unusual because the estate's gates were coded and nobody arrived without clearance. Especially not before 6 in the morning. Especially not in multiple vehicles. She heard voices in the corridor. Low, quick, male, the kind of voices that did not belong to household staff. She stayed in her room. She had enough sense for that. 40 minutes later someone knocked on her door. It was Mr. Kong, the estate manager, who had the expression of a man doing a job he had not agreed to do. Miss Amari, Mr. Park has requested that you pack a bag. She looked at him. A bag? Yes. For how long? Mr. Kong paused in a way that meant he knew the answer and had been instructed not to say it. He says to bring the comfortable shoes. She packed the bag. She packed the comfortable shoes. She stood in the main entrance hall with her single bag and her envelope, which she had kept out of principle, and watched 2 men in suits coordinate something on earpieces near the front door. Ji-hoon appeared from the study corridor. He was in a jacket now. He had his phone in one hand and the particular expression he wore when something was moving on his schedule that he did not like. He looked at her bag, looked at her shoes, gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. You're still on the clock, he said. I haven't agreed to anything. $5,000 an hour. She stared at him. For what? She said very carefully. He looked at her for 1 beat. Watching K-dramas. For monitoring purposes. And then he walked out the front door, and Mr. Kong picked up her bag, and Amari stood completely still for exactly 3 seconds before she followed. Because $5,000 an hour was a sentence that required a physical response. Outside, the black SUV was waiting. She got in. The private estate was 3 hours outside the city and it was, somehow, worse than the first one. More marble. More gray. More architectural choices that suggested the designer had been given an unlimited budget and a single emotional reference point. The ceilings were higher. The windows were larger. The silence was the specific kind that came not from emptiness but from very deliberate, very expensive soundproofing. Amari stood in the entrance hall with her single bag and looked up at a chandelier that made the one in the east corridor look cheerful. It's bigger, she said flatly. The estate, Ji-hoon said, moving past her toward the main corridor. The chandelier. He didn't answer. She hadn't expected him to. She was given a room that was larger than her entire apartment, with a window that faced a garden that had clearly been designed by someone who took gardens seriously as an artistic pursuit. There was a sitting area. There was a writing desk. There was a bathroom with heated floors, which she discovered by accident and then stood on for 30 seconds longer than necessary because it was March and she had opinions about cold floors. She sat on the edge of the bed, looked at the room, looked at her bag, looked at the envelope still tucked in the front pocket. Okay, she said quietly to herself, in English this time, because she was no longer certain which languages were private. Okay, $5,000 an hour. You watch some television. You figure out what is actually happening. You do not get comfortable. She unpacked 1 change of clothes, left everything else in the bag. Dinner was at 7. She expected to eat in a staff kitchen or alone in her room, or in some other arrangement that maintained the appropriate professional distance. Instead, Mr. Kong appeared at her door at 6:58 and led her to a dining room where the table was set for two. Ji-hoon was already seated. He had a document open on the tablet beside his plate. He did not look up when she sat down. They ate in silence for 4 minutes. "What are we monitoring?" Amari asked. "Currently? Whether you'll last the meal," without commentary. She looked at the centerpiece, an arrangement of black stones and a single white orchid that looked like it was being punished. She looked at it for a very long time. 3 more minutes, she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "The orchid is imported." "I wasn't going to say anything about the orchid. You were looking at it." "I look at things. That's not a crime." She picked up her fork. "What's actually happening, Ji-hoon?" "The cars this morning. The earpieces." Mr. Kang's face. Something moved. He set the tablet down. It was such a small gesture, but she had been reading the architecture of his habits for 8 months, and she knew it meant she had his full attention. "There are people who have decided you're interesting," he said. "I'm not interesting. You are to them." "Why?" He looked at her across the table with that measured, unreadable stillness he wore like armor. "Not yet," he said simply. She understood from his tone that "not yet" was not a deflection. It was a timeline. He would tell her when it was time and not before, and pushing would produce nothing. She had learned this about him the way she'd learned the coffee, through observation, through patience, through paying attention to the shape of his silences. She picked up her fork again. "Fine. What are we watching?" "You choose." She looked up. He was already looking at her. "You're serious. You have the remote." She chose a drama she'd seen twice already, partly because it was good and partly because she knew exactly where the emotional beats landed and could therefore monitor her own reactions and appear professional. They moved to a sitting room with a screen that was aggressively large. Ji-hoon sat at one end of the sofa. She sat at the other. There was a distance between them that was perfectly appropriate and also slightly ridiculous given that they were two people in a private estate watching a show about a woman who fell in love with her bodyguard. Amari made it 20 minutes before she forgot to be professional. "He's going to lie to her," she said, pointing at the screen. "In Korean. Automatically. He has that face. That's the face of a man who thinks withholding information is the same as protecting someone, and it is not, sir. It is not the same thing at all." Ji-hoon said nothing. "She's going to find out in episode 7, Amari continued. "And when she does, she's going to be upset not because of the secret, but because he chose for her. That's always worse. Someone deciding what you can handle." She shook her head. "Disrespectful." She glanced sideways. Ji-hoon was watching the screen. His expression had not changed, but he had shifted, incrementally, approximately 4 inches further from his end of the sofa. She noticed. She said nothing. By episode 2 she had her feet tucked under her, which was not professional, but the heated floors had been followed by a cashmere throw on the arm of the sofa, and she was only human. By episode 3 Ji-hoon had stopped pretending to check his phone and was actually watching the screen. By episode 4 they were close enough that she could have rested her head on his shoulder if she had completely lost her mind. She kept her head where it was. She was perfectly in control. She fell asleep 11 minutes into episode 5. She woke up in her room with no memory of how she'd gotten there. The cashmere throw was over her. Her shoes were on the floor beside the bed, placed neatly side by side. She stared at the ceiling for a long time. "You are not getting comfortable," she told herself. She was absolutely getting comfortable. The days at the private estate developed a rhythm she hadn't asked for and couldn't fully resist. Mornings were hers. She explored the grounds because the gardens were genuinely extraordinary once you got past the aggressively monochromatic design philosophy of the house itself. There were cherry trees along the east path that were 3 weeks from blooming, and she found herself walking there each morning with a coffee she'd made in the estate kitchen, watching the buds and cataloging them with the same patient attention she gave everything that was quietly becoming something. Afternoons Ji-hoon worked. She could track his location in the house by the temperature of the rooms. The study ran warm, the phones in the east wing activated in clusters, The kitchen staff moved at a different pace when he was nearby. She documented things out of habit, organized things that didn't need organizing, and tried not to think about the fact that she was very good at reading a house that was occupied by a person she was working very hard not to read too carefully. Evenings were the problem. Every evening at 7, dinner. Every evening after dinner, the sitting room, the screen, the sofa. Ji-hoon always had the remote but always handed it to her. She always chose. He always watched. He started talking during episode 6 of the second drama she picked. Not much. Not emotionally. Just observations, dry, precise, occasionally devastating in their accuracy. He doesn't deserve her, Ji-hoon said, about a male lead who had just delivered a grand romantic gesture. He really doesn't, Amari agreed. The gesture is a distraction from the pattern. She turned to look at him. Yes, exactly. Everyone focuses on the gesture, but the pattern is the actual data. He looked at her. You think in data. I think in patterns. Languages are patterns. People are patterns. What's my pattern? The question landed quietly, without weight, like he'd asked it before he'd decided whether to and hadn't pulled it back in time. She felt the shift in the room, the small recalibration of something that had been carefully maintained. She looked at the screen. You make yourself hard to read, she said carefully, so that the people who give up easily do, and the information that reaches you gets filtered through everyone who didn't. She paused. But you watch things when you think you're not being watched, and what you watch is never what you're pretending to watch. The silence that followed was a different kind than the ones she'd catalogued from him before. It had a texture. The orchid, she added, because she needed to say something lighter, was imported from Thailand. I looked it up. It costs $400. You put it in a centerpiece where nobody could appreciate it. You appreciated it. I criticized it. Same thing, he said. From where I'm sitting. She didn't answer that. She turned back to the screen. The drama played on. 4 inches of sofa remained between them. Neither of them moved into it, but neither of them moved away. It was the locket that started it. Amari wore it every day, had worn it every day for 11 years. Since the afternoon her father pressed it into her palm in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and bad coffee and told her to keep it close. It was small and brass and not particularly beautiful, shaped like an oval with a faint engraved pattern on the front that she'd always assumed was decorative. She'd never been able to open it. The seam was too fine, the mechanism too precise for something that looked so ordinary, and her father had died before she thought to ask him about it directly. She'd assumed it was simply broken, a sentimental object with a stuck clasp. She stopped assuming that on a Tuesday morning when she came back from her walk along the cherry tree path to find 2 men in the study with Ji-hoon who were not lawyers, not associates, and not anyone she recognized from the regular rotation of serious-faced people who passed through the estate. She knew because of the way the room changed when she appeared in the doorway. Both men looked at her with the specific, calibrated attention of people who had been given a description and were now confirming it against the original. Ji-hoon looked at her with something else entirely. Amari. His voice was even, controlled. The voice he used when things were moving that he needed to stay still. Give us 20 minutes. She gave them 20 minutes. She sat in the garden with her coffee going cold in her hands and watched the cherry tree buds and counted her breathing and told herself that the way those men had looked at her was not her problem and was almost certainly explainable, and she would wait for the explanation because she was a patient person who thought in patterns and patterns always resolved. The pattern resolved in 40 minutes. Ji-hoon found her on the garden bench. He sat beside her without preamble, without the usual measured distance, closer than he'd ever chosen to be in daylight, in the open, without a sofa between them. He looked at the locket. Your father, he said. Tell me about him. She kept her eyes on the cherry trees. He was a good father. Bad businessman. He loved languages almost as much as I do. That's where I got it. He could read 6, speak 4. He worked in technology in a field he never explained very specifically, which I thought was modesty but apparently was something else entirely. She paused. He died 3 years ago. He left debt. I've been paying it. The debt wasn't real. She turned to look at him. Ji-hoon met her eyes with the directness, he only ever used when something was too important to soften. The people your father borrowed from, they weren't creditors. The debt was constructed. It was a mechanism to keep you findable, traceable, in a known location with a known income and a known routine. The cherry trees blurred slightly at the edges of her vision. She blinked. Why? She said. One word. Flat and precise. Your father wasn't a man who worked in technology. Ji-hoon's voice was steady, careful, like he was carrying something fragile across a long distance. He was one of the best cryptographic hackers in the world. He worked for private entities, government-adjacent organizations, people who needed things buried or retrieved that couldn't be done through official channels. He was extraordinarily good at what he did, and he was extraordinarily careful about who knew it. Amari looked down at the locket in her hands. Before he died, Ji-hoon continued, he created something. A digital key, the kind that doesn't just unlock a file or an account. The kind that unlocks infrastructure, buried financial architecture. 11 years of transactions that certain very powerful people have spent 11 years making sure stay buried. Her thumb moved over the engraved pattern on the locket's face. He hid it, she said slowly. Not a question. In the one thing he knew you'd always keep close. The silence that followed was enormous. She sat inside it and let it be enormous because there was no making it smaller. The debt, she said finally. The agency placement. The estate. The people who constructed the debt needed you employed in a location they could monitor. They placed you through a compromised agency. He paused. I found out about the placement 4 months before you arrived. I had the agency reroute you to my household instead. She turned to look at him fully. You knew. Before I ever walked through your gate. I knew you needed to be somewhere they couldn't reach you easily. I didn't know about the key then. I thought keeping you close, keeping you visible to my operation, would be enough of a deterrent. And the language. She heard the steadiness in her own voice with a kind of distant surprise. You understood everything I said. From the beginning. From the beginning. She stood up. She needed to be standing. She walked 3 steps toward the cherry trees and stopped with her back to him, the locket warm in her fist. 11 years of wearing it. 11 years of it sitting against her sternum, through job interviews and language exams and hospital waiting rooms and the quiet grief of being someone's only person and then suddenly not. Through all of it, this small brass oval, this broken clasp, this thing she'd held onto because he'd told her to keep it close and she had loved him enough to obey even after he was gone. It wasn't broken. It was never broken. She turned around. Ji-hoon was watching her with the particular stillness he wore when he was allowing something to be hard instead of managing it into efficiency. You should have told me, she said. Yes. From the beginning. You should have told me. Yes. He didn't qualify it. Didn't explain it. Just held her eyes and let the accountability sit where it belonged. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive thinking. Choosing the honest answer over the clean one. Because you would have run. And running would have put you directly into the path of people who have been waiting 3 years for exactly that. That wasn't your choice to make. No, he said. It wasn't. She looked at him standing in the gray morning light in the garden he'd never once used before she started walking it. And she thought about patterns, about data, about the shape of a person you'd been reading for 8 months without fully understanding what you were reading. She thought about the snacks left outside the study, the coffee never mentioned, the 4 inches of sofa, the shoes placed neatly beside the bed. She thought about the way those men in the study had looked at her locket. How many people are looking for it? She asked. Currently? 2 organizations. One of them is primarily interested in the financial data. The other is interested in making sure the financial data never surfaces, which means they're interested in making sure the carrier of the key doesn't surface either. She absorbed this. And the gala next week. The one Mr. Kong put on my calendar without explanation. Ji-hoon tilted his head slightly. You saw that. I organize his calendar. I see everything. She crossed her arms. Neutral ground. It was supposed to be. Supposed to be. Intelligence changed this morning. Both organizations have confirmed attendance. She looked at the cherry trees. Almost blooming. 3 weeks she'd been watching them and they were almost there. I'm going to need a dress, she said.
Ihon blinket.
It was the closest thing to surprise she'd ever seen on his face, and it lasted approximately 1 second before the composure returned. You want to go? I want to finish this. I want to know what's on this key. I want to know what my father built and why he hid it in something he put in my hand on the last day I spoke to him. She met his eyes. And I am not going to sit in a garden while other people decide what happens to things that belong to me. We've established that I don't love that approach. Something moved in Ji-hoon's expression. Through the composure, through the control, through all the careful architecture of a man who had spent years making himself unreadable. It looked briefly and undeniably like pride. There's a car going to the city tomorrow, he said. For the dress. I know what I want. I assumed. She walked back toward the house. At the door she stopped without turning around.
Yihoon.
Yes. The men this morning. The ones in the study. She paused. Were they yours? A beat. Yes. Good, she said and went inside. Behind her, in the garden, Ji-hoon stood alone with the cherry trees for a long moment before he followed. The dress was black. Not the gray adjacent, charcoal. Apologetically dark black that populated Ji-hoon's entire aesthetic universe. Actual black. Deep and deliberate, with a structure at the shoulders that meant business and a length that meant she could still run if running became necessary, which she was no longer ruling out as a possibility for any given evening. She had picked it herself. The stylist the estate had arranged kept pulling things that were softer, more traditionally elegant, more in line with the kind of woman who attended high society galas as decoration. Amari had smiled politely at each option and put them all back and taken the black dress from the back of the rack where it had been waiting with the patient confidence of something that knew its moment was coming. She paid for it herself. The estate account was available to her. She used her own money anyway. When she came downstairs the night of the gala, the entrance hall had 3 of Ji-hoon's men in it doing final coordination checks. Mr. Kong with his tablet and his carefully neutral expression, and Ji-hoon himself standing near the door in a dark suit that had clearly been made for him by someone who understood that some people didn't wear clothes so much as architecture. He turned when he heard her on the stairs. He didn't say anything. He looked at her with the full, unmanaged attention he usually kept distributed across a room, and for 3 seconds it was entirely concentrated in one direction. Then he said, "You're wearing the locket." "Always," she said. He nodded once, the way he nodded when something confirmed a calculation. He offered his arm at the bottom of the stairs. She took it because it was practical, because the heels were real and the stairs were marble, and for absolutely no other reason. "Are we safe tonight?" she asked quietly as they moved toward the car. "Reasonably." "That's not a yes." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She tightened her hand slightly on his arm and said nothing else. The gala was held in a building that had opinions about itself. Grand entrance, soaring atrium, the kind of lighting that made everyone look like they'd been cast in a film about people who had always been wealthy. The guest list was the particular combination of old money, new power, and strategic ambiguity that Ji-hoon's world ran on. Amari had been to exactly 0 events like this in her life. She moved through it like she'd been attending them for years, because language and pattern had taught her that most social environments operated on the same underlying grammar regardless of the vocabulary. Read the room. Match the register. Keep your exits mapped. She had 3 exits mapped within 4 minutes of arrival.
Ihon noticed.
She saw him notice. "East corridor past the second bar," she said quietly, without looking at him. "Service door at the end opens outward. The atrium skylight panel on the north side is on a motorized hinge. I saw the control panel near the catering station. And the main entrance has a 14-second delay on the security lock if the internal alarm is triggered." Ji-hoon was quiet for a moment. "How do you know about the skylight panel?" "I looked it up when Mr. Kong put this on my calendar. I always learn the layout of a space." She accepted a glass of water from a passing tray. "Also, the venue's smart home system runs on a Helix 9 controller. I recognized the panel model. We had the same system at your main estate." Ji-hoon turned to look at her fully. Something had shifted in his expression. Not the pride from the garden, something quieter and more fundamental than that, like a man recalculating the distance between where he thought he was and where he actually was. "You spent the last week preparing," he said. "I spent the last week being prepared. There's a difference." She looked across the room, scanning. "Which ones are yours tonight?" 11 in the room. 7 outside. "And theirs?" "We've confirmed 6. Possibly 8. She sipped her water. "Which organization? The ones who want the data or the ones who want me gone?" "The ones who want the data sent a representative to negotiate. That meeting is scheduled for 10. His voice dropped. "The others don't schedule meetings." She absorbed this with the same steady attention she gave everything. Then, "So the second group is here for an action, not a conversation." "That's our current assessment." "When?" "We don't know yet, which is why I need you to stay within your sight line." "I know." She glanced sideways at him. "I'm not going to run, Ji-hoon. Stop managing me." "I'm not managing you. You're using your logistics voice, the one that means you're moving pieces around a board." He looked at her with an expression that was as close to caught as she'd ever seen him. "I don't have a logistics voice. You have 7 distinct vocal registers and I have cataloged all of them. Currently you're at number 4. She set her glass down on a nearby table. "Use number 6. The one that sounds like you're having a normal conversation. It'll help." His mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Not quite, not one. "You cataloged my vocal registers." "I cataloged everything about this estate and everyone in it. That's how I did my job." She met his eyes. "That's how I did all of my jobs. I pay attention." He held her gaze for a moment that lasted slightly longer than a normal moment. Then, very deliberately, he modulated his voice to something warmer and said, "The representative from the first organization is by the East Bar. Gray suit. He's been watching us for 6 minutes." "I know," she said. "He has a tell. He looks at the locket." Ji-hoon's jaw shifted slightly. "Stay close to me." "Reasonably close," she said, and moved with him toward the center of the room. The 10 o'clock meeting happened in a private alcove off the main hall. The gray-suited representative was a compact, careful man who introduced himself with a name Amari immediately recognized as constructed. He had the mannered precision of someone who had been educated expensively and deployed practically, and who understood that the most dangerous people in any room were the ones who looked like they didn't belong there. He kept glancing at her locket. She kept her hand away from it deliberately, because touching it would confirm what he already suspected, and she was not in the business of confirming things for people who hadn't earned the information. "The key," the man said, cutting through the pleasantries after approximately 90 seconds, "is no longer a private matter. The data it contains has implications that extend beyond any single organization's interests. We're prepared to offer significant consideration for its voluntary transfer." Amari said nothing. Ji-hoon said nothing. The man looked between them, recalibrated, addressed Amari directly. "Miss Amari, your father was a brilliant man. What he built was extraordinary. But carrying it is a liability you inherited without consent. We're offering you a way out." "I've heard that offer before," Amari said. "From the people who built the fake debt. They called it a way out too." The man's expression shifted fractionally. "We're not affiliated with." "I know you're not," she said. "That's why I'm still talking to you." She held his eyes. "But I don't make decisions about things that belong to my father in alcoves at galas with men whose names I don't actually know. If you want a real conversation, schedule a real meeting through Ji-hoon's office with documentation that tells me exactly who you represent and what you intend to do with what you're asking for." The man looked at Ji-hoon. Ji-hoon said nothing. He had the expression of someone watching a performance they were deeply invested in. The man looked back at Amari. Something in his posture settled, not defeat, but a reassessment. "You're not what we expected." "I know," Amari said simply. He excused himself. They watched him move back into the main room. Then it happened fast. Not from the direction she'd been watching. From the north, the side she'd flagged, the side with the skylight panel and the catering station. 3 men moving with the specific, coordinated efficiency of people who had rehearsed. Ji-hoon's hand closed on her arm. He turned, putting himself between her and the movement, and for one compressed, crystalline second she saw his face. Not the controlled architecture, not the logistics voice, not any of the 7 registers she'd catalogued. Just him, fully present, frightened of exactly one thing. Then the sound she would remember for a long time, sharp, close, the gasp of the room, and Ji-hoon's arm jerking backward, and the dark bloom of red against his jacket sleeve. He looked down at it, looked at her. "If you quit now," he said, with a calm so outrageous it rewired something in her chest. "Who puts the band-aids on?" A breath. "I'm very delicate." Amari looked at his arm, looked at the 3 men still moving, looked at the catering station 12 feet away with its Helix 9 control panel. She took 3 steps. She found the panel. She thought about Baby Shark for 1/2 second and felt no shame at all. She pressed the button. The sprinklers came on all at once. Not the delicate misting kind. The industrial kind, the ones designed to suppress actual fire, releasing water with the pressure and commitment of something that had been waiting a long time for a reason. The effect was immediate and total. The gala, which had been a carefully maintained environment of controlled elegance, became in approximately 4 seconds a very expensive, very confused swimming pool. Amari found the second panel control. Scrolled. Selected. The speakers, 12 of them, positioned for maximum atmospheric coverage throughout the soaring atrium, activated at full volume with the opening notes of Baby Shark. The 3 men stopped moving. One of them slipped. The marble floors, which had been chosen for their beauty rather than their traction, were not performing well under pressure. The second man turned toward the sound with the expression of someone whose threat assessment training had not included this specific variable. The third looked at his colleagues, looked at the ceiling raining water, looked at the room full of soaking wealthy people, and made the calculation that this operation had moved outside its parameters. Ji-hoon's men moved in from 3 directions with the practiced efficiency of people who had been waiting for exactly this kind of chaos to provide cover. It was over in 90 seconds. Amari stood at the catering station with her hands still on the panel and her black dress soaking and her locket warm against her sternum, and watched Ji-hoon's security team complete their work with the calm attention of someone watching a pattern resolve. Baby Shark continued for another 45 seconds before she turned it off. The sprinklers she let run an extra 10 seconds because they deserved to finish what they'd started. Ji-hoon appeared at her shoulder. His jacket was ruined. His arm had been wrapped at the elbow with something improvised. She could see the edge of what looked like a pocket square, pressed tight. His hair was wet. He looked like a man who had been through something and was declining to acknowledge it. He looked at the panel, looked at her. "Baby Shark," he said. "It's psychologically disorienting," she said. "I know." Pause. "I'm adding it to your performance review. I don't work for you. You're currently on the clock." She turned to look at him fully, standing in the wreckage of the gala, surrounded by his people managing the aftermath and bewildered guests wringing water from their formal wear, and she felt something move through her that was not adrenaline and not relief and not any of the things that made practical sense given the circumstances. It was something quieter than all of those. Something that had been building for 8 months in kitchens and study corridors and on sofas with 4 inches of careful distance between them. She looked at his arm. "You need an actual bandage. I have people for that." "Your people," she said, "have been using a pocket square. Come here." She found the first aid station near the catering setup. There was always a first aid station near catering, in her experience, because wealthy people and open bars and marble floors were a combination that planners had learned to prepare for. She sat Ji-hoon down on a chair that probably cost more than her old monthly rent, and she unwound the improvised dressing, and she examined the wound with the clear-eyed practicality of someone who had decided that feelings could wait until the bleeding had been addressed. It was a graze. Deep enough to bleed significantly, not deep enough to be the crisis it had looked like in that first terrible second. She cleaned it. She dressed it properly with what was available. She worked with the focused quiet she brought to everything she did well. Ji-hoon watched her hands the entire time. "You're not shaking," he said. "I'll shake later," she said. "When it's useful. Most people would have. I'm not most people." She secured the bandage, sat back, looked at him. You stepped in front of it. Yes. That wasn't part of any security protocol.
No.
She held his gaze across the small charged space between them. The atrium was still chaotic around them. Voices, movement, the efficient aftermath of Ji-hoon's operation containing the situation, and inside all of it they were somehow very still. Why? She asked. He looked at her the way he had in the garden with the cherry trees, with the thing that moved through his composure when he stopped deciding whether to let it. I didn't keep you here because of the key, Amari. His voice was at register 6, the warm one, the real one, the one she told him to use at the gala and that he hadn't fully used until right now. I kept you because you're the only person who doesn't look at me like I'm a monster. He paused. Also, you're the only one who knows how to make my coffee right. She stared at him. That, she said carefully, is the most unhinged thing anyone has ever said to me. I have an image to maintain. Your image is currently soaking wet and wearing a first aid bandage applied with gala supplies. And yet, he said, here you still are. She looked at him for a long moment, at the controlled architecture of a man who had spent years making himself unreadable, sitting in a ruined jacket in a flooded atrium, telling her the truth with the same directness he gave everything that was too important to soften. She thought about the horse painting, her father's horse on a gray wall, which she had roasted in a language she'd assumed was private and which had turned out to be the language her boss spoke better than she'd expected. She thought about the sticky note in her locker with the number she'd been crossing off. She thought about cherry trees almost blooming and heated floors and a cashmere throw placed over her by hands that had never once asked for acknowledgement. She thought about a small brass locket and a father who had trusted her with something extraordinary without explaining why, the way he'd always trusted her, completely quietly without making her feel like a liability. She thought about what it meant to be seen by someone who could have kept you as a useful piece on a board and chose instead to sit beside you on a sofa and hand you the remote. The debt, she said. It's gone. Cleared 3 months ago. I should have told you immediately. You should have told me a lot of things immediately. Yes. We're going to have a longer conversation about the withholding information as protection approach. I know. It's not protection. It's just deciding for someone what they can handle. I know, he said. And the way he said it told her he had watched that drama more carefully than he'd let on. She stood up, straightened her soaked dress with the dignity of someone who had decided that circumstances did not get to dictate her bearing. She extended her hand. Ji-hoon looked at it. We're going to negotiate, she said. Tomorrow. With the gray suit representative through proper channels with documentation. The key gets turned over to a neutral international authority on terms my father would have approved of. The buried data surfaces through legitimate channels where it can do what it was designed to do. She held his gaze. And I'm going to be at that table. Not adjacent to it. Not briefed after. At it. Ji-hoon looked at her hand. Looked at her face. Took her hand. You'll need a title, he said. I'll choose my own. 3 months later, Amari sat at the head of the boardroom table. The room was on the 42nd floor of a building that had no signage on the exterior and a view of the city that made most people stop and stare. Amari had stopped staring at it after the first week. She was too busy. The locket sat at her collarbone where it always had, where it always would, not a liability anymore, not a target, just a piece of her father she carried forward into whatever came next. The key it had contained had been handed over 6 weeks ago in a meeting that had taken 4 days, 3 lawyers, 2 government observers, and approximately $900 in takeout food. The data it unlocked was now in the hands of people accountable for doing something real with it. Her father, she had decided, would have found the whole thing both satisfying and slightly ridiculous, which meant he would have loved it. She had a bowl of snacks open in front of her. This was not standard boardroom protocol. She had made it standard. The men across the table were seasoned, careful, expensive in the way that meant they had never once in their careers been out-negotiated by someone who had previously cleaned their equivalent's kitchen. They were recalibrating in real time and she could see it and she found it useful. She was 3 points into a 12-point negotiation and she was winning on all 3. Behind her right shoulder, Ji-hoon stood with his arms crossed and his face unreadable to everyone in the room except her. She didn't need to turn around to know his expression. She had catalogued it already. The set of his shoulders, the quality of his stillness, the way a man who had spent years being the most dangerous presence in any room looked when he had decided that standing behind someone else was exactly where he wanted to be. It looked like pride. Quiet, absolute, and completely undisguised. She reached back without looking, held out her empty coffee cup. A pause. Then she heard him move to the machine on the credenza behind them. 2 minutes later, the cup came back over her shoulder. She took it, sipped it. Perfect. As always. She set it down and returned to the negotiation. There is a version of the story that is just about a woman paying off a debt and leaving. That version ends at the resignation letter, clean and simple and free. But the real version, the one worth telling, is about what happens when you stop making yourself invisible. When you let someone see the full shape of your competence, your humor, your grief, your father's legacy, your opinion of their horse painting, all of it, and they do not look away. Amari spent 3 years with her head down, moving toward a finish line that turned out to be a starting line. The lesson she carried forward, worn close to her chest like a small brass locket, was this. The people worth trusting are not the ones who protect you from the truth. They are the ones who eventually, imperfectly, tell it, and who make space for you at the table when it's time. Ji-hoon spent years building walls that worked on everyone except the one person talking to herself in his kitchen in a language he understood perfectly. The lesson he carried forward was simpler and harder. Being known is not the same as being exposed. And the right person knowing you fully is not a liability. It is the only thing that matters. Thank you for staying until the last word. If the story held you, if it made you feel something, if Amari made you want to stand up a little straighter at your own table, like this video, leave a comment telling me which moment got you, and subscribe so you're here for the next one. I read every single comment. Every one. See you in the next story.